Hi, this is David Kirshner of the West Hempstead Echo website, and thanks for joining us for a special interview with Karen Brohm, President of the West Hempstead School Board, and Joel Press, the District Assistant Superintendent for Business Operations, otherwise known as the School Finance Manager. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us again.
We're here at the middle school, a week away from the school budget revote, which will take place next Tuesday, June 20th. The school year is almost over, but we still have a budget that needs to get approved. So let's kind of dive into the details, if you will. The school budget's $74.1 million, and it was rejected by or shot down by 201 votes, or 17% in the May elections. The school board then submitted a new budget that was unchanged from the previous budget. Can you explain the board's decision and strategy for keeping the budget the same?
I'm not going to speak on behalf of all the board members. I know that the majority of the board has adopted the same budget that was put out the first time. I know one of your questions earlier was if the vote was negative the first time in the realm of 201 votes, why is the choice to put back out the same budget?
Right.
So again, we've said this at the board meetings. 1,300 people came out and voted no for the budget. 201 more people than voted yes for the budget. And we've discussed this now. This is our second year in a row coming here and having these conversations. And a lot is about complacency. We can't take 1,300 as the sole representative of the 13,000+ people that live in West Hempstead and that have the ability to vote. We have to remember the fact that even though they didn't come out and vote, that's not a no vote. It's a, I didn't think I had to. I didn't think it would fail. I didn't know I had to. I didn't know I could. There's, believe it or not, a lot of people in district that don't realize that they have to come out and vote when they move here from, the city or Queens, the Bronx, whatever. They don't know that they have the ability to vote for the school budget.
Right.
So they may not have come out. So our indication from having a few meetings and speaking to people on the street, I know there are still people that are going to come out and vote no. There might even be more people that are going to come out and vote no. But the indication from the community is that they don't want to take the risk of losing things by lowering the budget.
Right.
Our decision, my decision, I will say, was based on the fact that we worked very hard at that first budget. We know that it's a fiscally responsible budget. We know it has long-term planning ahead of us. We know that it's keeping the programs in place, and we know that we've made cuts along the way. We're continuing to do so. We've spoken about it over and over again, that as people are leaving and choosing to retire, if there is no need to replace a full-time teacher in that position, we're not doing so. As evidenced by this year's budget, we reduced the FTEs by 2.6.
Right.
We already reduced the budget $230,000 because at the last minute we were given a savings of $230,000 by the health insurance companies, which was a great relief because originally we were okay with going out at 243 because we felt that it sustained everything we needed to sustain, including fixing the buildings and any kind of repairs that needed to be done, any kind of security measures that needed to be done that weren't included either in the bond or the Smart Schools Act, including the educational programs that the children are taking great advantage of. And we feel that it took us a long time to get to that spot. We feel that Joel, is looking at the best interest of West Hempstead and the district. We don't find that there's anywhere really we can cut.
No,
we're going to
I
have to.
understand.
If the budget does not pass, we're going to have no choice.
Right. But at the end of the day, to quote a famous president, elections do have consequences. So, the election did have the election. The vote was to not approve the budget. And in the case of where we were last year, and in very, very similar circumstances, the board did take the decision to do some, what I would consider some minor cuts. There was a total cut of about $256,000, and it was a good gesture. It went over in the community, and the vote passed on the second time. Why not take that same approach, this go around?
Because I think and I think Joel will speak to this. I'm going to, let him do it also, but because I think that we've taken that and used it when we constructed the budget in the first place. Instead of going 256, or looking for something or adding things, we're trying to cut back, and we're doing that slowly, as we've discussed. When we combined the secondary school, we said slowly we would find cuts and slowly we would find decreases as we had attrition, as we had programs that changed, to allow for those small cuts in the budget. So we've already put that in there, and if you want to add to that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what Karen said earlier was that when we had the original budget that we discussed in March, and then when we realized that savings from the medical insurance, we built that in. So last year, our original budget in May was at the cap. We reduced it about 0.5% for June. This year, we made that 0.5% or approximately 0.5% cut in May, thinking that that might, engender some support from the community. By all objective measures, this is a responsible and a reasonable budget. If you look at the average budget increases across Nassau County, the average increase is 6%. Our increase was 4.2%, almost a third lower than the average. And our tax levy increase was around, the average in Nassau County was 1.91%. So we're right in that same ballpark as the average of every other district across Nassau County, and we're lower with our tax levy increase than a lot of the surrounding districts in this area.
And that's fantastic. But again, the question still remains. The voters basically were saying we're not happy with the budget, and there could be the impression of, well, the school board is not really listening to the will of the voters because they're giving us a budget that doesn't have any cuts, whether they're symbolic, real, or hurtful. There's nothing here. So, if you voted against it, you're basically saying, my vote really didn't count and I won the election. It's sometimes a hard thing to swallow.
I'm going to disagree there because I do agree with what Karen had said earlier, that I think there's a lot of complacency out there. We're the only school district on Long Island that put up a budget with a tax levy increase below the tax cap, at or below the tax cap, that did not pass. I think there's a lot of districts where the voter turnout has gone down since the implementation of the tax cap. I think what happened last year, I think people just thought, oh, it happened last year, it's a one-time thing, that won't happen again. The numbers are up from May of last year. The numbers in May this year were up from May of last year. So that's one point that I would like to make. There were a lot of people.
Which numbers are up?
Voting
The
numbers.
voting numbers.
Okay.
Yeah, both sides. Yes, and the yeses and the nos were higher than they were in May of last year. We've talked to a lot of people and heard from a lot of people after the vote. First of all, we had these meetings here in the auditorium. 2 meetings. The overwhelming majority of what we heard from people who showed up was the budget is responsible as is. So I don't think it's necessarily that, the no vote may be more fervent and they showed up. Right. But last year when we cut, so the June budget where we reduced the budget, there were more no votes than there were in May, even with a cut. So
no, I get that, but then why have the vote? I mean, if there's no action.
Well, there was action though, because we had
You're
a
saying
lot
the
more
action
yes.
took place before, the cuts were made before the vote, or I'm confused as to, how you feel that the issue was addressed when the budget still stayed the same.
I think the overwhelming number of community members who showed up at the budget meetings said that we should that the budget was responsible, put up the same budget. And I think the thought was, people will realize, wow, so many people that we heard from and spoke with said, I didn't vote, I didn't know there was a vote. And so I think that, I think that's what's going to potentially.
Like a raise of hands or a head count, or just sort of a feeling that the majority
it's the
of
conversations in the community. It's the conversations at the meetings. It's the, if I know you weren't at the last meeting, but if you were standing at the last meeting, the majority of that auditorium was there saying, put back up the same budget. The people that I know I've spoken to plenty on the street, some that are going to vote no, some that are always going to vote no. I mean, I have a neighbor who voted no when we went out with a zero. Do you know how many no, we had no votes? We went out with zero, no increase, and they still came out and voted no. I respect that. It's everybody's right to come and vote no, and the no votes are coming.
Sure.
But I think now that we've educated people more and we've explained to them what they're getting and what is happening with this, percentage increase, I also think that now people understand that they're allowed to vote or that they have to vote on Long Island as opposed to being in Manhattan. I think that's where you have to understand that 1,300 people don't speak for 13,000. The problem is the 13,000 have to come out and vote. I mean, I don't expect all 13,000 to come out and vote, but you need to have more people out there voting. And I think that now that complacency is tweaked a little bit. I understand that people are saying, and maybe this is not the right thing to say, well, last year we voted no, so they cut it a little bit. We cut it before we even went out with the budget. We were going out, again, at 243, which we found to be fiscally responsible. We found it to be reasonable in the shadowing of what's going to happen moving forward with the lack of aid that's going to come from the state next year and everything like that. That being said, if I went into a store and I argued that my price should go down and they lowered my price that time, the next time I go into the store, I'm going to argue that the price should go down. And it's not necessarily the exact same thing, but if we put up a budget every year and we cut it every year, then every year that vote is going to go no.
Understood.
Because people think that we're going to just go back and cut it because there are people who believe, and within their right to believe, that there is extra money that we can just take and put it out there. And if we take from those reserves and we take excess from those fund balances, what happens when we really need that?
Okay, and we'll definitely get to that. And as you mentioned, going into a store, there's been a lot of talk about this $155, average per household increase, and there's been a lot of comments made in social media, and I heard one of the comments in the public forum. What's your perspective on the $155 number? Is that the right number, and B, is that a reasonable expectation along what's happening in the rest of Nassau County?
Well, I mean, I did the calculation, so I'm going to say it's the right number.
Okay.
No, but it's an estimate because it's based on property values that are not yet finalized. So I took the most recent information that we received from Nassau County. I think that increase is, I mean, I haven't looked at it and compared it to other districts across Long Island, but I think it's a reasonable number. It's a reasonable increase, reasonable average increase out there. It's not excessive. I live in a district where the increase is higher than that, and the budget increase was, I believe, 7%, and that budget passed with, I think, close to 70% of the vote. I don't think the number is outrageous. It's in line with the increases that we've been proposing over the last few years. And given the rate of inflation that we're all dealing with, the school district is dealing with that as well. So a 2% increase in an environment where in 2022 the rate of inflation was 8%, which is it's lower now and it's trending down, but it's still above 4%. So I don't think that's an unreasonable number.
There was another mention that the run rate for the budget basically ran at 96% against the budget, which from what I understand is pretty darn efficient. I mean, you're almost up, running against budget. But there's 4% there that didn't hit the budget. At the end of the day, what happens to that money? And if you took 1 or 2%, which is actually a fairly sizable amount, it would be able to plug in some of these numbers. Do I have it wrong?
I think there's a misconception to what that means when we say we spend 96% of the budget. I'm going to let the finance guy talk about it, but
Okay.
I think that's a lot of the problem is where people are just hearing we spend 96% of the budget and they think we have 100% of the money.
Right. So when and I've been trying, and I don't know that I've been successful in trying to explain this. If you were to look at it as the budget was $100 million, right, just to make it easier to do calculations, and we spent 96% of the budget, so there's $4 million unspent. Now, if we budgeted revenues that were 95% of the budget, and the other 5% was reserves and fund balance, essentially pulling from our savings account, So in that scenario, we're pulling $1 million out of the savings, right? Are you following?
Yes.
I'm trying to find a way to explain it. I'm better with pictures. Now, if the suggestion is lower the budget, so you lowering the budget 1%, right, in return for a 0% tax levy. That's the argument. So say lowering it to 94%, the budget on the revenue side. I'm still spending 96% of that budget, so I'm still spending $96 million. Now, instead of taking in $95 million in revenue, I'm taking in $94 million in revenue. So the difference now, I've got $96 million in expenses and $94 million in revenue. Now I'm spending $2 million, right? I'm running a deficit of $2 million that I'm pulling out of the savings account. So that's the way I see that.
And is any of that triggered by the decreasing enrollment numbers? Is that why you're saying that there's a gap? Or I'm not sure, you're talking about revenue, but revenue in this case is based on head count. So
Not entirely.
No.
Okay.
No. Revenue, this is another part of the equation that I think there's been a lot of conversation in social media about revenue and where the revenue comes from. Revenue comes from foundation aid, which is based on enrollment in part, but we also get revenue from other sources based on expenses. So transportation aid is an expense-based aid. BOCES aid is an expense-based aid. Not based on enrollment, it's based on what we spend. So there's a number of a bunch of the state aid that we receive that's based on expenditure, not necessarily on enrollment.
But if your expenses were $100 million in your example, the $100 million would be there to cover the $100 million of expenses. No?
Not in the revenue, right? Because if you look at our revenue projections, and it's not true revenue, but pulling money out of reserves and fund balance is not revenue. It's not new money. We put that in there in the event that we are short on the revenue side. So if the tax levy plus the state aid plus other miscellaneous revenue comes in, that's the 95% I was talking about. So I budget 100%, revenue and expenditures have to match, but if I budgeted for new money's revenue that comes in every year, that's recurring at 95%. And if I hit 100% on the expense side, I got to hit 100% on the revenue side. So that would be $5 million coming out of the savings account. So our recurring revenue that comes every year is tax levy, it's state aid, and it's other revenues that we receive for various reasons.
So what happens if the budget is defeated? Where do we go from there? What kicks in, and what's the next step if it doesn't go through?
Unfortunately, if the budget is defeated, we automatically go to contingency budget, which is 0% increase, so our budget is the same as last year.
On the tax levy.
On the tax levy.
So that's $71 million?
But the tax levy remains the same. So
Same.
that
Oh,
increase
okay.
that we budgeted of about $960,000, that increase goes down to a $0 increase.
So it's a $960,000 decrease
Yes.
in essence would be kicked in?
That's,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. And has there been discussion of what if, and if that were the case, where would the school board be looking to make cuts if that does kick in?
Well, there are state regulations as in regard to like what we can finance and what
Sure.
we can what we can pay for if we go into contingency. So we have to follow those regulations. We have to prepare for anything that will educate the child. There have been conversations at central office. I know that that's the case. However, to speculate on what could be cut or what would be cut right now, I don't think would be wise on.
Okay.
There are some things that do come out by regulation. So
Right.
any new equipment purchases would go away. Any new leases of like office equipment, we lease copy machines, we lease postage machines, things of that nature would go away. Use of facilities by outside organizations, those expenses related to that would have to be covered fully. We could not let them come in and use the facilities at no cost, which could be very costly to some of the local programs. A custodial cost, for example, on a weekend could run $200, $300, $400, $500. Sunday is double time, so it could be very expensive for the outside groups. Those are the things that are built in. Other things that are sort of at the option of the Board of Ed, it's sort of open at that point to conversation.
And, at the same time, we are looking at decreasing enrollment, or the numbers are just kind of going in the wrong direction. How does that play in this kind of scenario? Because that also means that there would be less money coming into the school district as well, putting additional, weight on how things are going to go.
It depends. A decrease in enrollment doesn't necessarily equate to a decrease in the foundation aid, right? That's the main, it's the main source of state aid. It is based on enrollment, but there are categories within the foundation aid that could increase if, poverty rates increase, ELL rates increase, student with disability rates increase. It's all factored into this ridiculously complicated formula there. There is typically there's a hold harmless from the state. They won't say you get zero. There's a baseline. They recognize that costs increase every year. But the cost increases, the aid increases that we've seen over the last few years, as the state has finally decided that they were going to actually fully fund the foundation aid formula. They have done that over the 3 years leading into 23-24. So now everything's fully funded. They fully funded the formula about 15 years after it's created. So the formula itself needs some updating. But I think there is a certain hold harmless there. And as those expense-based aids, as the expenses themselves increase for things like BOCES and transportation, we will see some increase there in revenue, but not to the level that we're seeing these last few years.
Are there new projections as far as the enrollments go? Because the last reports I looked at were like 10 years old, and I don't know if there's been new updated numbers, or am I looking at the most current information that's out there?
We have budgeted for an enrollment study in next year's budget.
Okay.
So if the budget passes and we have the funds there, we'll do the enrollment study there.
Because in general, I'm curious, because on the other side of ECHO, we cover, the business side and what's going on. And there's a heck of a lot of building that's going on in the community. And just alone in the Liquidators, shopping area, they're building a complex with over 400 units. At the old Western Beef, at some point, they're going to be building. Anywhere where there's a plot of land, there's buildings going up. And at some point, there should be a positive net impact on enrollment. So I'm just kind of curious, could we project that or potentially see that in a new report?
All I can say is, I was here when we did the original report. And while yes, enrollment right now is trending down, I don't think that they did that report projecting enrollment trending down because more people were sending their kids to private school. So when it comes to those buildings, that are coming in there, we don't even know if they're going to be seniors that are moving in there because they're going to sell their houses. We don't know if it's going to be, business people or professionals that want to catch the train. We don't know if there are going to be children living in that building. There's not many children living in West 130 that come here. I know at one point we had a count on it, but I don't remember what it was. But, if you're getting 10 or 15 kids out of a building that has 428 apartments, that's great. But back to as far as the enrollment study goes, I believe it's very hard, truly, to figure out where exactly that trend is going to be, because something could turn tomorrow and the community, if they did an enrollment study in Manhattan, COVID hit and everybody moved out of Manhattan.
Yeah.
So something could happen and it could be completely different than what they're anticipating.
For sure. You could hit, for example, a recession and a lot of parents may decide to pull their kids out of private school and send them to public school immediately, and, things like that do happen.
Yeah.
I just want to point out that, in terms of, while enrollment may be declining, the class sizes in our classrooms are, at the elementary level are in the low 20s. So it's not like we don't have reasonable class size. That's a good amount. Even our kindergarten, the average class size 25, which is above what we would want it for a kindergarten classroom. But the class sizes are, they're not way below, the average on Long Island.
But how do you, but without having this information of where the community is going, how do you predict classroom sizes and how many teachers will be needed, or,
That's a
there
year-
has to be some sort of guidance.
It's a year-by-year thing. I mean, we start every year at one number, and they plan a schedule accordingly for what we believe, whoever's still here in June is coming back in September, and we plan the schedules accordingly. But in August and September, and we're prone for this in West Hempstead, we get new registrants. 3 weeks ago, I was in the kindergarten center, and they were getting a new student. So we do get new students throughout the entire year, whether they're coming from, outside of New York, or whether they're coming from Manhattan or wherever, they just, continue to come.
So Karen, you had mentioned before that there were 2.6 headcount savings, I think, in this past year?
Yes,
Do I have that
2.6
right?
FTE that we
And
did not
both-
replace for this coming
Right, for this coming year.
budget year.
And is that a trend that will be continuing in the future, or, are there going to be more teachers who are retiring and their positions won't be filled, or they will be filled? Do you have an idea
I
of
think
what-
it would be based on scheduling, and that's what we said when we combined the buildings, is if those teachers are not needed to be replaced based on the class sizes and scheduling and enrollment, then we would not replace them.
Got it. So,
Yeah, I think just on that topic, I think the approach that we've taken in central office is to take a reasonable, responsible look at staffing, and I've mentioned this before in the budget meetings, we're not trying to, lop off a limb just so that we can go out with a zero. We're looking over time, and we've done this at staffing, and the staffing has decreased over time. The number of teachers that we have that are employed by the district has decreased over time, and that's even in the face of new regulations for E&L students, increasing rate of special ed students that require additional staffing.
Yeah.
That's where we've been seeing
that's-
a lot of the increases in terms of, in staffing. It's not that we're hiring teachers or we're, increasing the number of classroom teachers, but, an elementary special ed student could have 4 adults helping to educate that child, or, there may be 7 or 8 adults that have contact with a student at the elementary level on any given day. But the overall staffing and just sort of non-teaching staff and teaching staff have decreased over the years.
Understood. So in social media, because of course, that's where I live, we're hearing things like that the board wants to charge for use of baseball fields and facilities, and, that there would be potential cuts in things like busing, and they should be using the reserve fund. I mean, there's a whole, cacophony, if you use that
Right.
word, of different things that are out there. Can you comment at all about, what's floating out there on social media?
Well, first of all, I would say, don't believe everything you read on social media.
No.
Yep.
I tend to try to stay off social media at this time of year as much as I can. I post here and there just to kind of put out factual information and ask people to reach out to me if they want to have a conversation. As Joel mentioned before, the possibility of having to charge organizations throughout the district for use of the fields when there's a cost associated with it. So like on the weekends, if we'd have to bring a custodian in for that purpose. If we go to contingency, it's not the board wants to, it's the board has to. It's part of that state regulation of what we would have to do. That would be missed. Nobody's looking to cut busing, and at no point did anybody ever say we were cutting busing. At no point did anybody from the district side say that busing would be cut. It's just not a fact. However, consolidation of bus routes, consolidating 2 smaller buses into 1 larger bus is always a possibility if it saves money. Those things are always practical. Those things are always about, what's the easiest route. We try to make it so that the kids are not on the bus for an extended period of time. If it's better for us to send 2 vans so it's a shorter bus route, we do so. But if we're saving money, I mean, as we talked about last time, the cost of sending a child out of district on a bus could run up to $60,000 a child. It's very rare. $60,000 is an anomaly. But it's about, it could average $5,600, $6,000. For some schools, for some children, And, when you have 2 and 3 children going on one bus for that kind of money, as opposed to consolidating routes, that's where that problem could come in.
Yeah, I would agree. We don't, the Commissioner of Education has said that bus routes out of district up to an hour and a half are not unreasonable. We try to stay to an hour, so we're well below what the Commissioner said is reasonable. That could change, and if it's a contingency budget, and we've got a cut, we need to look at everything. And we wouldn't look only at busing. But again, if I, and we have started looking at everything to see, right, because this is potentially a reality on Wednesday, and we're not gonna, or Tuesday night, and we don't want to come into Wednesday and first start looking at that because our fiscal year starts 10 days later, or 9 days later. So we've looked at that, and taking 2 vans and putting those students on one bus could save us $50,000 right there. If we've got to get to $960,000, it's a long way to get there. But that could be. But we're not cutting anyone's busing, right? We can't, because everyone is entitled to busing out of district. Up to 15 miles, they're entitled to busing. So we can't unilaterally make that decision. So we will continue to bus. The routes may look a little different. The in-district activities may look a little different. There's a lot of things we would need to look at.
Okay.
And if I may, I just want to touch back on that, on the field space and the gym space issue. A lot of the reasons, we're field poor in West Hempstead. There are no public fields. There are no public parks. Unless you're going to Hempstead Lake State Park, we are field poor here. So we choose as a district not to charge, because we do have the ability to charge for those things. We choose to allow the community to use the fields on a regular basis, and we want them to continue to do so because we want our community to have those teams and have that the feeder teams that come into the schools. But unfortunately, children's soccer registration is going to go up. Their Little League registration is going to go up if they have to make those payments regarding having custodians here or anything like that. And we don't want that either, because now you're just finding the cost somewhere else. You're paying that same fee just somewhere else.
Understood. So the reserve fund, we hear a lot, well, if you only took $1 million out of the reserve fund, life would be wonderful. Actually, I think we may have heard that from a board member. Is it as simple as that? And can we just take some monies out of the reserve fund right now and plug some of the levy taxes and some of the holes that are perceived to exist because of the no vote on the budget?
So we could take money out of reserves. I could eat ice cream for 3 meals a day. It's not healthy for me. It's not healthy for the district to just pull money, actually not out of reserves, right? Because we budgeted for the maximum use of reserves. And I do encourage anyone who's viewing this to go back and look at our budget presentations. I know this stuff is dry. It's not the most interesting stuff to look at. But go back and look, and we talk about reserves. I talked about reserves ad nauseum. I started last year because out on social media, there were conversations. You got $17, $18 million. Don't raise our taxes at all. Use it. It's not that simple, right? None of the school finance is that simple. There are people out there that want to make it sound simple, right? Because it's easy when you say it. When I try to explain things that are complicated, people look at me and they're like, I don't understand that, and I get it. That we have reserves. Reserves are the largest part of our sort of savings account. We can only use those reserves, the money in those reserves, for the specific purpose that those reserves are set up. So the employee retirement reserve can only be used to cover employee retirement payments. Teachers' reserve can only be used to fund teacher retirement payments, things like that. So I can't go into the teacher's reserve and say I want to cover the increase in busing this year. The fund balance, so this is where I think people kind of get a little confused, and the folks on social media are not helping. Fund balance is sort of, some of it's this unrestricted pool of money. So we're allowed to hold up to 4% in unrestricted reserve fund balance. So we can use that for what we need to use it for. We have appropriated $2.4 million of fund balance, as a source of potential revenue in the budget. So we are appropriating reserves. We are appropriating fund balance. The reason why last year we had an operating deficit, which means our revenues, recurring revenues came in under budget, under budgeted expenses. We're looking at the same thing this year as well. That's how you use reserves, right? Again, social media, oh, you should use the reserves. We budgeted to use reserves. I'm going to leave you with my presentation that I've done where we show the budgeted use of reserves has increased significantly. The actual use of reserves has increased significantly. So we're doing it. If anyone's saying that we're not, that they're not being truthful. So we have done it. We've done it to levels that I feel are reasonably responsible. But it's not something that we can't continue to run deficits, forever, because that's pulling money out of the savings account that we're not replenishing.
At the end of the day, West Hempstead, like most communities, is changing.
100%.
The demographics are changing, the economics of the community are changing, and for the most part, in good ways. But how is that going to change the perspective of the board going forward, and how do we look towards making sure that we match the expectations of the community, but most importantly, at the same time, still make sure that we give the kids the highest level of education that we possibly can have?
If you're asking me, we have to continue to budget responsibly. We work very diligently. Central office works on this budget for months prior to giving it even to the Board of Education. We look at what's coming ahead of us. We're looking at what's going to be here 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and we're trying to make sure that we're going to have money to keep the district intact 2 years, 3 years from now. So every time it's about taking money out of what people are calling our savings account, what happens when that savings account runs out? Then there's going to be nothing to pull from. So we go back to 10 or 12 years ago when they tried to put a 9% budget out. Now, granted, we can't put a 9% budget out because we're never going to be able to pierce the tax cap in West Hempstead, nor would we want to. But if we go out with a 0 this year, we have to go out with the top of the line next year. So if we go out with a fiscally responsible budget every year, and we look at what's happening in district every year, and we reduce staffing if we need to every year, or increase staffing if we need to, it's based on who's here and what's going on in the building. Yeah. As Joel said, with the increased population of ENL students, or if we have additional special ed students coming into the building, we could have to increase staffing based on, maybe a one-to-one, maybe a monitor, maybe something like that even that just has to be added. But I think that the best thing to do for the community is not only to listen to the community, but to listen to what's going on in the buildings.
Yeah.
And I just want to, if I can tack on to that, right, because we put a slide out and it's being interpreted and misinterpreted. But a lot of the increase in our costs is associated with students who are not in the public schools, and I just want that to be clear. Our transportation costs have gone up over the past few years. They've more than doubled in the last 7 or 8 years. Right. The amount that we pay for out-of-district transportation far outweighs what we pay for in-district transportation. And so that's part of it. The students that we send out to BOCES, because BOCES has a better placement for those students. Those are costs that are increasing as more and more students who move into the community, including students who attend non-public schools. There are costs associated with those students, and in some cases, we are paying $100,000 for one student who's, a special needs student at a non-public school.
But again, those are the exception, and I understand everything that you're saying, but as it relates to private schools, at the end of the day, it still costs less in the school district to pay for busing than it does to pay for a kid who's in your classroom and who may need it and is local.
Not always.
Not always.
But in most cases, yes. How could that not be?
Because if you look at some of our transportation costs, even at the sort of lower end, it's costing us $2,000 a month maybe to transport a student. So, if you're saying...
Okay, but how much does it cost to keep a kid in the middle school, for example, for all-in for a whole year?
Depends if it's a gen ed student or a special ed student.
Regular student.
The numbers that come out in terms of like the cost per student can often be skewed by special ed students that are a lot more costly. If you look at New York State when they calculate tuition rates for when we charge for out-of-district students who attend here, so those special ed rates are significantly higher than the gen ed rates. So a gen ed student is not as very costly, and again, it also depends, is it K-6, is it 712?
Yeah, but give me a number.
Right, but here's the issue again, I think, and I'm going to let you finish that, but I just wanted to jump in. I think people just like to say, we have 1,600 kids, the budget is $74,000, so divide 74,000 by 1,600 kids, and you're paying $42,000 per kid. And that's not, and I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but
Right.
this is what's out on social media.
Right, I understand
And
that, but
if we're paying, here's the thing, you're talking about, nobody is saying that the budget is the way the budget is because of private school. At no point did anybody say that, except on social media. But if you're looking at a household, this is the argument. It's not about how much it costs the kids to go here, because anywhere, any district, you're looking at, a $30,000 cost per kid, most places will say. That cost per kid, I don't agree with, only because it includes legal fees, it includes this, it includes that. As far as I'm concerned, I always feel like those costs should get pulled out of anything, because they should also fall onto anybody in the district. However, a child coming here, let's say it would cost us in an elementary school, I don't know.
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you could be talking about $13,000 a year, like a gen ed elementary
Right.
student.
okay, but so even if it was $10,000, taking out overhead, and busing for private school is, let's say, $2,000-3,000. There's still
A
the
month by
delta.
10 months.
It's,
Right, when I'm talking like $2,000, when we're talking $6,000, those are monthly costs for some of the
Per
out-of-district.
student.
Per student.
No. So if you take an average, and I'm sorry to stay on this point, but I think it's important. If you take a student, let's say, for example, that goes to Hartora in Queens, just as an example, I know you have a lot of school buses that go there. What is the cost per child, or better yet, how would you calculate what the cost is per person, per student for the full year?
So that one actually is interesting because we were just looking at that, because we were having a conversation with that school about busing for next year. Those, I'll take a Yeshiva HaTorah any day over, there's a Success Academy in Far Rockaway. Because we have one student going to Success Academy costing us over $6,000 a month to that school. Yeshiva HaTorah, when we can so we pay for the whole bus, right? The student we send to Success Academy, it's one student on a bus that happens to
Right,
be
but
going.
staying on Hartora.
Yes. No, I know. We get the whole bus. We pay for the whole vehicle, so it's more efficient. I'll take that. I'll take a Hank West Uniondale any day of the week.
But
When you
what's
put
the-
45
but
kids,
what's-
I'm getting to that.
okay.
Thing. The cost.
I feel like I'm back in Cablevision. Come on, no, give me a number, quick, give me a number.
Those costs are on the lower side. So we're talking. There was something we were looking one of the vehicles, probably about $2,600 a year per student. So that's on the lower end.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again, the delta is still, you still do a lot better in the school district busing kids out as opposed to having them educated within the school district itself. As a general
I don't
principle.
agree with that.
I don't agree
I don't
with that
agree with that
because you're
statement.
looking
In
at a
the
number.
general, you can't, you don't agree with that.
If that one student from Yeshiva HaTorah decides to come back here, doesn't really change a lot. We
But
don't have to
but
hire
talking
more
about
staff.
I'm making a general assumption.
Sure.
And it would seem very logical to say that just busing a kid back and forth in general is going to be a lot cheaper than having to educate them, every day, 5 days a week.
I'm not sure that, I think, if we took all of the approximately 180 kids from Yeshiva HaTorah and brought them back here, then we're talking, wow, there's an impact on staffing there. But I don't, we pay several $100,000 a year to bus the children to Yeshiva HaTorah. Bringing them all back here, 180 kids, would probably cost a little more than busing them to school. And we're not arguing necessarily for that,
Right.
but it's still an expense that we
Right.
incur. And again, I'll take that, and that's on the lower end. When we have 3, 4 kids that we're sending to a school somewhere out of district, that gets to be very costly. And we have a lot of that.
Understood.
And you have to remember that we're not just talking about busing. There are other
Right.
fees that we pay for in district for those children that are going out of district. It's not just a busing cost. So if it's
Yeah.
that particular school on the low end, whatever, $2,600, then when you add in health services and any kind of special services and any other fees that go out, that's,
There's nursing, we pay for nursing, we pay for textbooks. If there are special ed students, we are responsible for related services. That could be costly as well. So
it's not a fair assumption to just say
Right.
it's cheaper to send kids out of district.
Understood,
Yeah.
understood.
It's very, again, I'm going to go back to, it's very complicated overall. We can't just sort of generalize to if a student comes back, it's more costly for us to educate that student than it is to send them elsewhere. If we took back 180 students and spread them across the 14 grades that we have pre-K to 12, then the impact is minimal because you can put those kids in the classrooms and the staffing doesn't need to change. So there's a lot of factors that go into that.
Right. So I want to thank you again, and we wish you all the best of luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And this has been David Kirshner from WestHempsteadEcho.com, and this has been a special edition of This Week in West Hempstead. Thank you.